This is Cow, the podcast. Yeah, hi there. You're listening to Cow, the podcast. This week, a delve into nationalism, racism, xenophobia, extremist violence, and claims that social media is to blame, that we must curb the likes of Google and YouTube in order to stop it. But wait a moment. Didn't we have terrorism and violence and hate speech some time before the internet came along? What's going on? What's really at the heart of it? So, science. It can prove that race doesn't exist. I'm not going to go into that, not in any detail here today, into why or race doesn't exist, other than to say it's basic maths, apparently, about shared differences between populations and across populations, about having more differences with your neighbour than you do similarities, and at the same time having more similarities with people all across the world than you do differences. That's the nature of genetics, and that means talking about race begins to make no sense when you start asking deeper questions about population groups or lineages, and that's great. But science can also show how differences between populations do exist. How about Inuits and West Africans, for example? An example of selection within populations for environment. These are phenotypes, different expressions of a genetic base, differences showing particular adaptations to environment, adaptations in this case to either cold or heat. Now that's great too. But now we have a paradox and a division which sets us up for a fight. Now, both are right, and both can be used as a factual basis for argument. The paradox is a question of different scales, of different perspectives, of seemingly opposed views, framed within the questions we're asking and in the answers we're seeking. And this continues to be a thing across cultures and populations everywhere. We are pre-programmed to explain experience through narrative and difference through opposites. And as I've tried to point out before, our beliefs, our truths, are narratives that have evolved in answer to particular sets of cultural questions. They are layers of environmental structure. As in Brett Weinstein's ideas about metaphorical truths, truths that through narrative, when held within a group, contain our thoughts and our behaviours and help that group to thrive, despite being literally untrue. This week, I'm trying to get into a meta of my own. It seems that being the chemical balls of trouble that we have evolved to be, it is at least one of our go-to behaviours to join up in groups, to rally around a flag, or a football team, or a god, or a nation. We create a group narrative that brings us together because we are social creatures. Think X Factor, think football. Think nation state, think race or religion or politics. Even science is no different in this respect. My point is that we are drawn to these wrongs and rights, these black and white binaries of our own particular narratives. And in being so drawn, and in taking one side or another, we continue to perpetuate the important and frequently unidentified problems in the meta-narrative that lies beneath. We are distracted and don't see the meta, and we skip straight over the problem, unable, therefore, to find sustainable solutions. Now, in terms of race, the answer is staring us straight in the face that we, humans, as products of a blind but effective evolutionary past, are pre-programmed for division, for prejudice, for mistrust, and for violence against others. And it's easy to warn against the dangers of anthropomorphism, to state that it's a mistake to extend human characteristics to animals, or to extrapolate human behaviours from animals. That doesn't make it true, and I'm going to do it here. We are animals. We are mammals. We are apes, like the chimpanzees famously observed by Jane Goodall in the 1970s, who, in her research, which was deeply shocking at the time, uncovered violence, murder, and long-running tribal warfare. The groups were essentially warring over the control of resources. Yes, we may be more complex, but I'm guessing I don't need to provide evidence for similar human behaviour. We are pre-programmed to defend our own groups and to attack others, and we are capable of expressing this. Are we really so different? The question comes down to what we do about it. What if this were our go-to position? What if we were able to recognise the monkey-brained fears and take control of them? What if we were to acknowledge that this is a thing? Hang on, no, I hear you ask, what has this to do with American inventors? You've called this American Inventors. Well, look, if you can't wait, just Google it. But bear with me. First, it's been a busy week, a confusing week, and so much happening. I'd been tempted to start out just gently picking away at the dangers of censorship, the dangers of having communication throttled, monitored, controlled in a defence of free speech, and to talk about the role of big data in this, how our big data future might pan out if we simply refuse to deal with it and take it head on. It's social engineering. It's mind control after all. But along came the attack on the New Zealand mosques, which began to bring some additional focus to my thinking, and an argument for active censorship began to gain some traction with me, understandably. We'll come to that title later, but Radio 4 Friday morning I wake up to the news of the massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand, an attack on the mosques, which we now know killed 50 people. And the BBC reported one Australian senator as saying, this violent vigilantism can never be justified, but it highlights the growing fear within our community of an increasing Muslim presence. He said it is wrong to blame gun laws or those that hold nationalist views. What has gone wrong is allowing Muslim fanatics to migrate to New Zealand in the first place. He was, in coded language, echoing the words of the Shooter's Manifesto. To be clear, I can't remember if they were his exact words, and I'm not going to bother with his name. I'm passing on what I heard on the radio and the media and what I read in that manifesto. So this is Radio 4, and I'm not having a go at the BBC here. I'm trying to build a distance between us and the narrative, trying to see through it, to step out of the go-tos, because there is something very distasteful about those comments, to be sure. But this distaste comes from our understanding of the subtext, the metatext, from the conclusions and value judgments that the speaker assumes. Much of the superficial content, the words themselves, have a veil of innocence about them. This paradox we need to tackle. It's not the words themselves, but the subtext. We need to find out what gives this narrative some form of validity. So what do our go-to responses look like? What do we as rational, peace-loving citizens do with comments like that? What is the mainstream approach? Okay, firstly, we could refuse to repeat the message. We don't want others getting hold of it. We remove it from the greater consciousness because there's no doubt that once it's aired, then it becomes part of the narrative. And as we know, this is the narrative that we've seen before. Importantly, it's the narrative that we refer to define ourselves, to create our sense of self. The idea of ignoring or repressing a point of view, the less said the better. And yes, there's a case for this. Reporting a minority view does have the effect of providing coded support for more extremist views. Secondly, though, we report it and we take issue with it, as did the BBC this morning, referencing the power of social media to bring about all kinds of cohesions or fractures in the echo chambers as they're known. There's no doubt that this is a dangerous road, but if we're not careful to stay focused, the effect of associating social media with fears of violence becomes itself a call for more censorship. In the words of Sophia Patel from Hope Not Hate, what is needed is that these arguments, in the same way as they are constructed, must be deconstructed by equally powerful voices, providing facts, not fictions, or simple versions of the truth. We'll concentrate on that later. For now, Sir Mark Rowley, former head of counter-terrorism at Scotland Yard and a distinguished fellow at the Russie think tank, was asked to comment on the attack, and he said, "We've always had racist thugs committing crimes. They are now more organised and have more terrorist ambitions to kill politicians, police, and to kill minorities. And perhaps in recognition of a rising political will to control the powers of social media companies in the air as we speak, he was asked about the potential effect that social media might have to infect others. What part does social media play in radicalising our terrorists, or in the promotion of our copycat acts?" And Rowley stated that the social media companies are a problem. He said, "Social media companies are monetizing our attention. They do this by pushing us towards the most titillating, bizarre, and unusual, and in some cases extremist material." He said, "This has, possibly unwittingly, helped with this kind of ideology and with conspiracy theories, both Islamist and on the extreme right, in helping them to propagate and to grow, and in helping to form cells and networks of like-minded individuals." But he didn't limit it solely to social media. He went on to say that this is frankly aggravated by mainstream politicians, where small numbers of them in Western countries are using intolerant rhetoric to extremist effect. Take our Australian senator, for example. Or I would say Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, Theresa May, Donald Trump. What is happening is that the intolerant rhetoric of these mainstream politicians legitimizes the violent ideas of extremism by providing coded support for it. The politicians themselves may not be violent, but this coded support moves the political spectrum closer to the extremist agendas. And it isn't just the politicians. Individuals are also drawn into this and become part of the problem. Social media's role is in reinforcing this with the echo chambers. So no one's denying the role of social media in this, least of all me, but for reasons I'll go into in a moment, we need to remain very careful about where we begin to apportion blame for extremism. The knee-jerk reaction to the acts of terrorism at this moment in our history seems to be to call for controls on the flow of information and to blame the social media companies for conspiracy theories and fake news. This, in reality, is a simple extension of the argument that we should shut down the debate. It's a can of worms, and interesting, Rowley was asked his view on this in commenting on the existence of Islamophobia in the UK. It was suggested that some are nervous even of the word itself, and that this is no accident, in that it's a label that can be used to prevent criticisms of aspects of Islam that are not approved of. The idea of being able to shut down an argument simply by calling it out as racist or Islamophobic or as anti-Semitic has pretty much become a mainstream political tactic right now. It must be called out. Look at the trouble, for example, that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party has had with anti-Semitism. I'm conscious that I could talk about this in the abstract, but to open up the can of worms, I'm absolutely convinced that the charges are being levelled against the Labour Party in order to stop the traditional criticism of Israel's actions in Palestine. And if you think that's an overreaction, today, as I was researching approaches to racism, I was repeatedly being fed video adverts from an organisation called the Tikva Fund, imploring me to sign up for a video course in Jewish nationalism. They say the Tikva Fund is a philanthropic foundation and ideas institution committed to supporting the intellectual, religious, and political leaders of the Jewish people. The Jerusalem Post says, don't support the Tikva Fund, whatever you do. To all intents and purposes, this appeared to me to be an attempt to radicalize people in the cause of the Israeli state. Its author Yoram Hazony wrote The Virtue of Nationalism, in which he argues that if you're not a nationalist, then you're an imperialist. On the subject of shutting down the conversation, I'm with Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who is a Jew and also a fierce critic of Israel. In a video, which you can find on YouTube, there's an attempt to shut down one of his lectures by offended listeners when one of them is driven to tears. Finkelstein shouts over a baying crowd that precisely because of what he and his siblings learned from his parents is why he will not be silenced. I refuse, he says, to be intimidated by crocodile tears, and if you had any heart in you at all, you would be crying for the Palestinians. The parents Finkelstein talks about were lost to the Nazis in the concentration camps, as were the rest of his family. But it's a common fallacy when someone tries to win support or to shut down an opponent by exploiting his or her opponent's feelings of pity or guilt, to bring up crocodile tears, and another to shut down debate ad hominem, where genuine discussion of the topic is avoided by instead attacking the character, motive, or any other attribute of the person making the argument, the messenger. Both of these are a real danger to the democratic process, and they're commonly used within popular debate. I didn't sign up, in case you were wondering, for the courses in Jewish nationalism, but I mention this because it's at the heart of the problem that I started out with, and which think tank Rowley acknowledged. The problem in having search engines concerned only in learning how to compete better for your attention in pursuit of profit, and having them decide what we will see in our search results. It's an example of how this is working. Yes, the machines really do feed us with more and more contentious or extreme material. It's not coincidence. And yes, there is a need to combat this world of conspiracy theories, linking halal food to terrorist finance, for example, because conspiracy theories, when presented by a good enough orator, can become real in the eyes of their followers. So there emerges a general knee-jerk call for social media to be made responsible for what it says under the threat of law, and to take control of what we see, and ultimately to be responsible for our actions as individuals. Now, on one level, this is just the result of a simple case of ad hominem, of blaming the messenger, but on another, it's a shameful dereliction of our human moral duties, especially on behalf of those that seek to lead us or to protect us. This is about putting social engineering, whether you like it or not, into the hands of unthinking and unguided robots, leaving moral judgment in the hands of artificial intelligence, or perhaps even in the hands of our Silicon Valley hackers. The irony is that it's already happening. This is what the rabbit hole really looks like. And this is where our title comes in. American Inventors. Google American Inventors. Google the images and see what you get. What you get is a page of black inventors. Only black inventors. And that's great. I had no idea. But I also have to admit to having had a bit of brain freeze when I came across this. I didn't know what I thought about it, or in fact what I should think about it. I went into a shutdown of cognitive dissonance writ large, because all of the inventors I thought I knew about, and to be fair, it's not my area of expertise, they were white. Now, whatever we do dare to think about this, we have to acknowledge that it's there, and that what we are being fed has been manipulated. And we also have to acknowledge that every other result we seek through our use of the internet is also being served up that same way. The point about my cognitive dissonance, my shutdown, my cognitive paralysis is that I'm aware that I'm a product of my own echo chamber. I'm used to seeing what I'm habitually presented with. I'm used to the familiar, so much so that I can hardly imagine that any other valid perspective might exist. I'm pretty much forced into some form of psychological zombie state if I'm forced to confront this. As are we all. And the net effect of this, possibly unwitting control on our fundamental narratives, is to strengthen and to reinforce groups of like-mindedness as we wish. American Inventors shows us that it's happening already. And we're calling for more. Surely, if we, humans, individuals, are not here to make those kinds of decisions for ourselves, no matter how difficult they might be, deciding what we should be thinking and how we should behave, then what on earth are we here for? To view another side, many Muslims believe that Islamophobia is simply not taken seriously enough. It's not recognized or acted upon. And that's fair enough. This is true. And it's easier to be seen to be doing something now, to be tightening gun laws or outlawing extremist videos or demonizing social media giants, than it is to be identifying the causes of this behavior and tackling it where it emerges, addressing the real problem. So why don't we get the social media companies to do it? Well, great in theory. They'll be quick and efficient. They're already halfway there. Maybe they could promote a deep and meaningful discourse about inclusive and just and egalitarian social behaviour, enshrining our social norms in an ever-evolving programme of moral growth. Or will they just shut shit down? Because that seems to be what we're getting at the moment. Don't they say be careful what you wish for? So we might ask how mainstream politics might tackle the ideas behind this kind of violence without being accused of either promoting the extremists on the one hand, or on the other side, of silencing political debate, because as we understand, silencing political debate is one surefire way of adding fuel to the fire that we're attempting to put out. It is a difficult question. You can't silence debate. You can't silence citizens who want to air grievances. But at the same time, there's a line to be drawn between the legitimate protest and violent extremism, between legitimate debate and peddling hatred and bigotry. Now, Rowley again. He says, there are all sorts of prejudice in the UK, some on the rise, and Islamophobia is certainly one of them. He suggests that calls to equate Islamophobia with racism are born of clumsy thinking, and rightly so. But asked if we need to be alive to the threats to Muslims and Muslim communities, says yes, of course, absolutely we do. We cannot have that. He goes on, ironically, to say that extreme right-wing terrorism and extreme Islamist terrorism both share the same rhetoric, that white and Muslim communities are incompatible. Yes, the community roots are different, but beneath the surface, they share similarities. And to me, this is where we begin to get at the meta, or the subtext that I'm instinctively drawn to. Isn't blaming social media for the ills of society a little late, like shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, or blaming foxes for fur coats? This human propensity for violence, we know, is not a new phenomenon. So let's not shoot the messenger, so to speak, and let's begin to get at an underlying biology of the problem. What if the narrative underlying this is a simple, primal fear? What if it's simple fear that drives all forms of extremism? We need to call out this label, extremism, and I think to concentrate instead on the term xenophobia. From Wikipedia, xenophobia is the fear and distrust of that which is perceived to be foreign or strange. It's fear of the foreigner or the stranger, and xenophobia can involve perceptions of an in-group towards an out-group and can manifest itself in suspicion of the activities of others and a desire to eliminate their presence, to secure a presumed purity, and may relate to fear of losing national, ethnic, or racial identity. We're getting at a good point here. To ask to what extent extremist behaviour belongs simply to a lunatic fringe or is linked on a continuum with mainstream politics is a tough question to answer. There's a conflation of the two. There's a blurred line between the populist rhetoric and extreme activity. We've seen how these same words can be used to promote different subtext. And under the label of extremism, we can see how that subtext becomes obscured, often obscured enough to distract us from it. It's sloppy terminology, leading us into a state of cognitive dissonance, of shutdown. That is until we can reframe the question. If the question is reframed in terms of fear, natural but misguided fear, a xenophobia, we can gain a new and powerful perspective on the problem. We understand instinctively how fear can drive us to terrible acts, even to attack. And we can recognize factors that might contribute to this fear. We can begin to understand the subtlety of coded approval and reinforced stereotyping from the likes of mainstream politics and media, and we can begin to understand the full range spectrum and of our own part in it. Isn't the point that we might make an effort to understand these fears, to hear them, and to calm them? Who would comfort a frightened child with threats of punishment if they were to mention their fears? And who would ban a child from mentioning their fears whilst continuing to talk of the dangers and the threats in a coded talk as if they won't understand that on some deep psychological level? The effect is worse when it's covert. Who would want to perpetuate that child's fear? If we're to do this, politicians, broadcasters and media companies, take note. Social media may be our best chance yet. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Don't forget to drop by the website, cowthepodcast.online. Sign up for the newsletter or maybe support the work we're doing here. I've been Ant Biggs. Thank you for listening. Talk to you next week.